You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to Middle East Monitor. My name is Osman Butt. We're here with Sarah Hunaidi for our conversation on Syria, the Druze, and the uprising. Welcome, Sarah. Hi. So my first question is, Assad is the protector of minorities. What does this claim actually mean to those who are minorities in Syria, and what does it actually mean?
Okay, so as you know, Syria has a complicated yet very simple structure. So the Assad family comes from a minority called the Alawites. And if we look at numbers, religious demographics among the estimated 22.5 million Syrian population are Sunni Muslims, about 74%, Alawite Muslims, 11%, and other Muslims, including Ismaili and Ithnashari or Twelver Shia, are 2%. Christians, including, Greek Orthodox, Syrian Orthodox, Maronite, and all the others, are 10%, and the Druze are only 3%. So when we talk about protector of minorities, we realize that Syria has a lot of minorities, and it's a really winning tactic and winning rhetoric for any regime to be used. And it's not the only and first time it is used in Syria's history. We see that, of course, with the French. So Assad's rhetoric from the start of the uprising has been about protecting minorities. But this rhetoric, practiced for decades, only hurts, of course, the national solidarity between Syria's religious sectors. And it only, of course, divides. However, it's playing on fears. So it's not really a truth. It is, a political tool. But we see in Assad's prisons, we have activists from all religious backgrounds, including those minorities, Christians and Alawites and Druze. So, it's always important to look at the actions instead of the rhetoric.
But what has been the impact of this rhetoric? Because I know that there are claims when it comes to Syria that from early on, if I'm not mistaken, the whole notion that Assad is a protector of minorities was deployed by the regime almost as soon as there were protests. And I'm wondering about what impact that actually had for minorities in Syria.
So, again, it just played on the fear that people already have. Syria has been religiously segregated for a long time, and every religious group resides in a certain area of the country. We don't see a lot of integration in between sects, of course, with exceptions of Damascus. You see Damascus has everybody because it's where everybody goes to study and it's everybody goes to work. But it is still a big amount of Syria is religiously segregated. So when you use that rhetoric in the beginning, in a movement that is starting about uniting Syrians and having very broad but also specific wants and needs of the Syrian people as Syrian people, not as a certain sect, you see it is a very kind of useful tactic to remind people of their fears of each other. And because the majority is Sunni Muslims and they are not the ruling class. They have almost no say in Syria's political decisions. So it's always been a political tension, this reality. And of course, the easiest way to claim is, Sunni Muslims, you just claim the new world's fears like terrorism, and those Muslims are going to come and eat the Druze alive or something like that. It's just stories of fear, which of course, there are incidents because it's a segregated country. There are of course incidents of groups clashing, but at the same time, there are incidents of groups, living together. So it's all about the rhetoric and how it is used in order to suppress a righteous uprising.
And so, to sort of make sense of this, so to understand Assad as the protector of a minority is a kind of insurance policy for the regime in a sense. It's a way of guaranteeing the support of minorities, to say that, because I tend to think there's two dimensions to this, right? So obviously you have the fears of minorities themselves who do have them, but you also have, as you say, the Sunni majorities. And if, for example, you have Assad distinguishing, saying we have to stay because we need to protect the minorities from the Sunnis, it also plays into the Sunni fears. Is that
yeah,
that's a way to characterize it?
It actually is a very strong argument on side of the regime because it also claims to be the westernized regime where our dictator doesn't have a beard, he wears a suit but kills us anyway. So he plays on this kind of global fear of Muslims and Islam, but at the same time extremism, and at the same time it's still, as a regime, practices even more horrible methods, or like it's very competitive with extremists. So when it claims this rhetoric of protecting minorities, it kind of assures everybody, including its Western image and its global image, that we are the only, as the Assad regime, we are the only ones who can put an end to the Islamic extremism. That's like on a global scale, but on a national scale, of course, it also tries to put Syrians against each other, and by again using fear as a political tactic, you see a lot of minorities are afraid of the majority, and the majority is also afraid of the minority who already have taken power, and they do not want to share it. So yeah, I mean, it works on different levels, and it's a really strong, political tactic.
Okay, so could you tell us a little bit more about the Druze and their relationship to the regime, the uprising, and the protests?
So the Druze are an offshoot of the Ismaili branch of Islam. They broke out of Islam religion in the 11th century and created their own sect, and it's a secret sect. And they practice, for example, the concept of taqiyya, which is very important in the religion of Druze, because it allows the Druze to hide their religion if they were to be persecuted because they are Druze. So you see, it's a secret religion. It's closed on itself. You cannot convert to it. You cannot intermarry. And a Druze is only a Druze if they are born to both parents who are Druze. So yeah, and the relationship with the regime has been kind of turbulent, but also careful. So the Druze in Suwayda is, of course, the main majorly populated with Druze province. We don't see strong or big numbers of Druze in other places in Syria. We see them scattered like in Idlib, but they in Druze-centered province is Suwayda, and it's in the south of Syria. So they try to be autonomous because basically they don't trust anybody because, of course, of the history of persecution since the 11th century. They are seen by many Muslims or, extremists as infidels. And they are seen as not Muslims. So it's a very complicated religion, and the relationship with the regime. So it's when the revolution started in 2011. Now, just to give you a little bit of background, even before, the Druze have a history of rebelling under authoritarian leaders, like even rising up during the rule of the Ottomans and the French. Even like the leader of the Syrian Great Revolution is from Suwayda. So exactly, from Korea. And the protests. So there were protests that took place in Suwayda in 2011, but we have to remember that Suwayda was under tight control of the Assad regime, but that didn't stop people from participating in the revolution in other ways. For example, like throwing pamphlets and organizing fleeting short demonstrations. We call them مظاهرات طيارة, where you plan a lot of demonstrations at the same time, small numbers in different neighborhoods at the same time, so the police doesn't know where to find you. And it's like sometimes 10 minutes, it's like sometimes half an hour, but it's on the run. So these tactics, like people still found ways to participate in the revolution. We also saw prominent Druze leaders in the Syrian army who defected, and they joined the Syrian Free Army, like Khaldoun Zainuddin, for example, who was later killed in 2013 in action. We also saw Rijal al-Karama, which is the religious leader, a Druze movement. And Rijal al-Karama means men of dignity. So they were founded in 2012 by Druze sheikhs to protect all sects in Suwayda from any outsider risk, including Assad and its allies, Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah, and the Islamic State, of course. And we also we see them very much, present when the regime used to try to force the men to join his army. So, and of course, the troops to be drafted forcefully. But because it's a minority, we saw that it's been kind of sometimes seen as on the margins, because compared to like places like Homs and Halab, people have marched in huge numbers. But people of Suwayda have become progressively more opposed to the government during the years. It's been 9 years, almost 10, of the uprising turned into war. And we see a lot of Druze leaders making more statements against the Syrian government. We see the Druze religious leaders being jailed for not celebrating the re-election of Assad that happened in 2014. What else? We see, of course, a lot of men in huge numbers, like thousands, refusing to serve with the army, stating publicly that they don't want to participate in killing their fellow Syrians in other provinces. Like as you saw, it was turbulent relationship. It's a unique situation for them. It kind of dances weirdly in between autonomy, but also still considered under the Assad regime's control. So it's a very unique place.
Yes. So to follow on with that, so in last year, I believe you wrote a foreign policy magazine article where you talked about the local Druze in Suwayda, and I believe it was related to the kidnapping of Druze women by ISIS. And this was followed by, I think there was an attack at the time, and then the women were taken. But there was a lot of question marks over how this could happen and what the regime's role in all of that was. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the article was out to explain how exactly ISIS attacked Suwayda. So ISIS attacked Suwayda in 2018 in August, where there were simultaneously a big explosion in the middle of the city, and they were attacking it from the sides. What was really interesting and what actually shifted how Suwayda and people in Suwayda dealt with the regime from now on, from this incident on, is that people saw how sketchy the Syrian government was, dealing with the attack. And I'm gonna mention small bits is during the first 3 days of the merciless attack on Suwayda, for example, the Syrian army watched silently. And civilians were left on their own to fight with kitchen knives, hunting rifles, and whatever else they had. Of course, in 2 days, some 250 people were killed, 300 wounded, and dozens of women and children were kidnapped within one day. And at least one Druze woman was executed in Islamic State custody. And I believe that the attack on Suwayda was part of an Islamic State scarecrow strategy, of course, allegedly adapted by the Syrian regime in order to make religious minorities submit out of fear of both the Islamic State and the Sunni majority. So yeah, in July, we saw even precedents before this attack happened. In July, we saw Syrian troops defeated the group in Yarmouk Basin. Following its defeat, the Islamic State made a deal with the Assad regime and its Iranian allies to be relocated to Suwayda's eastern desert. I have family of friends who saw fighters as they were transported by the regime's green buses. People saw them being transported and treated, with dignity, while people who call for freedom are killed. And a month before the attack, Assad's troops had evacuated the eastern villages of Suwayda, one of which was Rami, which was the first place to be attacked by ISIS. And 3 days before the attack, the Assad regime stripped the people of Suwayda of their weapons, especially the people who resided in the east and northeast. Again, they were the first points to be attacked. And hours before the attack, the Assad regime cut off the electricity from those villages. These same villages were the first to be attacked before dawn. And this, I believe, is how Assad enabled a massacre in Suwayda, so he could claim that minorities needed his regime's protection. The regime has always relied on the Islamic State to terrorize the men of Suwayda into joining the Syrian army. And even they said it explicitly. A few months after the Suwayda attack, we see the regime had actually helped release a group of Druze women. They were taken by ISIS. And in a meeting with the women's families, Assad explicitly told the families that because the Syrian army had helped free the women from the Islamic State, the least they could do was urge the men to join the regime's troops. So it's not even shy in hiding this. So this is what the article was about, and it just showed and it kind of showed to everybody, even to the people who were on the margins. They didn't really care about politics. They didn't care who's in charge as long as they can live and breathe and eat. They saw how the regime reacted the first 3 days when they did nothing. So yeah, that actually shifted the relationship of the majority of the people in Suwayda with the regime.
Okay, we also saw, I think it was last year and I think earlier this year, more street protests in Suwayda. What were these all about?
The 9-year war had took its toll on people who remained in Syria. It's been 9 years, and it's not just, it's very long. The economy had already collapsed. People cannot afford to buy their daily bread, and above all, they are not allowed to talk about their daily struggles under this dictatorship, and that created a very foreseen built-up anger that has to come to the surface, sooner or later, and especially after the 2018 ISIS attack, and how that ruined, the their relationship with the regime. And more on that, I mean, I know you're going to ask me about the Caesar Act later, but yeah, I just want to say that this year, like, just remember it's been 9 years, close to 10, and people who could not escape this, the borders of Syria, they had to just take all of the toll of the 9 years, and there is no possibilities for any type of growth, whether in education or business or anything. And yeah, I mean, that's why people started to march to the streets, knowing, they've seen in 9 years what the regime can do. We can say in 2011, some people were surprised. We were like, we did not know how the regime was going to react to people. But after 9 years, you know exactly what's going to happen to you if you march to the street. And people were this desperate, because of their horrible living situation.
Okay, and as you mentioned, and for the last part, I want to talk a bit about the impact of the Caesar sanctions on the Syrian economy, because we keep hearing claims and counterclaims about what impact that's actually having on the situation in Syria. So from what you know on the ground in Syria, what is the impact of Caesar?
So first, according to the US Department of State, what is the Caesar Act? It is, the president just signed into law the Syrian Civilian Protection Act of 2019, and it was signed on December 20th, I believe. And it is named after the Syrian photographer who bravely shared with the world thousands of photographs documenting torture in Assad's prisons. Of course, it gave the US, as they said on their website, a powerful way to promote accountability for the regime's atrocities. So we are, of course, seeing other ways of holding the criminals under Assad regime accountable. We see in Europe, there were multiple cases that are now against prominent people. But I just want to point out that Syria's economy had already collapsed long before the sanctions began this year, and because of the 9 years under war. So most of the economic failures and struggles facing the Syrian people are kind of the Syrian government's fault, because of decades of long corruption even before the revolution even started, and citywide annihilation of neighborhoods after 2011. And of course, in addition to many weapon deals and drug deals that Hezbollah and Iran are conducting in Syria, and of course Russia is now renting the whole country from Assad, and it's getting its way to reach the sea. So that being said, the sanctions fell hard on Syrian people. Sanctions under corrupt states usually allow states to be even more powerful in, for example, the black market, and in many ways, uses to avoid sanctions because they're already powerful. We see the sanctions also being used against Syrian students who are trying to get admitted in universities around the world. We see them in also Syrian workers who are trying to apply for visas, which even is made worse. And sometimes, like, applying for work and applying for school is the only legal way for people to escape the horrendous situation inside Syria's borders. So the sanctions are kind of used as also a way to stop Syrians from escaping the war-torn country. So in very brief words, it was already horrible, and it made it even more horrible for people.
Yes, because I think there's been an over-attribution to Caesar sanctions on the actual economy of Syria itself, because, as we know, it was partly the war, but it was also the collapse of the Lebanese banking system, which really hit the Syrian economy quite hard. And now people, of course, are using the Caesar sanctions as proof that it's all the US is doing hardship in Syria. So as the very last question, you, of course, as somebody who lives outside of Syria now, you've encountered political debates and arguments from various factions, from mainstream political sources, from left wing to right wing sources and so on. And so I'm sort of wondering now, what is it you'd like to say to people about Syria that you feel has gotten lost in the whole politicking outside?
Syria is a very kind of unique, weird subject in political debates that is being had in the West, because it doesn't fall into the simplistic terms that the West is used to. Usually it's us versus them. It's extremists versus amazing, great people. And Syria doesn't fall under that. Syria has a very complicated history. It has a very complicated population, and it has a complicated conflict that is happening. And it is not even like 2011. It started with the people versus the regime, but now we see the whole world, of course, became part of this conflict. And sometimes there is wrong. I initially wanted to say there's no right or wrong, but there's always right or wrong. When people die, it's wrong. When people's rights are taken away from them, it's wrong. And when people are starved, it's wrong. But when it comes to like policies, or when it comes to intervention, sometimes you're doomed if you intervene, and you're doomed if you don't. Both of ways are hurting us as Syrian people, mainly because the Assad regime is very authoritarian, and it's literally its motto, people's motto who are with the Assad regime, it's Assad or we burn the country. And they managed to achieve both. They burned the country and they kept Assad. So I just require more compassion from people who follow Syria, because usually people, again, come from their simplistic terms of where is ISIS? I'm against whoever is, I'm with whoever is against ISIS, and that doesn't work in Syria. And let's not forget the righteous beginning of the revolution, because our memory is our responsibility. It is very important to remember what people revolted against, and just because things got worse does not take away from the righteousness of the movement that started. And let's also not forget the many activists and people and young people who are still in Assad's custody because they dared to say that I want dignity and human rights in my own country. I want to be able to vote. I want to be able to be my own person. So I feel that the world has forgotten about us, forgotten about these people, and it's just using Syria to prove in its own political debates, to prove the other side wrong. And that is just a horrible moral stance of the world, whether it's the left or the right. Both, actually, it was kind of disappointing to see the left not seeing Syria as its own entity. But nonetheless, after 9 years, there's nothing that surprises me anymore. So yeah, I just want people to remember, to practice, I call it political empathy, basically.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.